Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party virtual Enlightenment Salon of October 11th, 2020. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the US Transhumanist Party. Today, we're going to have a fascinating conversation about existential risk, about the COVID-19 pandemic, about biology and its potential applications to help humankind in its near-term future. We have a special guest, Jeffrey Ladish, who is a scholar in all of these areas. And before we get to Jeffrey, I will introduce our panelists from the US Transhumanist Party. We have our secretary, Pavel Ilan. We have our director of visual art, Art Ramon Garcia, and we have our director of scholarship, Dan Elton. So welcome to everybody. And Jeffrey, if you could begin by introducing yourself and some of your most recent areas of interest, as well as whether you consider yourself a transhumanist and what interested you in transhumanism to begin with. And as an icebreaker type of question, what do you think is the greatest existential risk facing humankind?
Great, yeah. So thanks for having me. That's a lot of questions. Let's see. Yeah, so I am a researcher. My specialty is looking at global catastrophic and existential risks. I also work as a security consultant, sort of helping out in information security and sort of just giving some advice to companies and individuals in improving their security. But yeah, in terms of, do I identify as a transhumanist? It's funny because I don't normally talk about this, but like, yeah, absolutely. I think just technology has enabled humanity to do so many great things, and I'm very excited about the potential of the future, both sort of the short-term and the long-term future. There's 200 billion stars in our galaxy, and we've only been at one of them, and it just seems like a shame. So yeah, I'm really excited about this whole area. But at this point, it's almost just like a sort of default part of my life. So but yeah, that's a good question. In terms of how I got into this, I think, well, I studied for a semester at Oxford in my undergraduate, and I joined the Transhumanist Club, Uni Club. And I think I never went to a single meeting, but I was like at the time very interested in transhumanism and was like, oh yeah, this is like a great group of people and a great like subject. And it's cool to see like a bunch of people thinking about the future. And then through the course of studying evolutionary biology, I became very interested in this question of, oh, like what are the actual risks of human extinction? So I think for me, I started out when I was sort of maybe 19 or 20, being extremely optimistic about all things relating to technology. It was very clear that we're making huge strides in the field of medicine, the fields of transportation, and just sort of making humanity just way better off. And I knew that there were risks, but I didn't take them very seriously. But once I started studying evolutionary biology and thinking about things from a more systemic perspective, I started to wonder if there were significant risks here. And I think encountering Nick Bostrom's work and starting to sort of branch into, like some people have taken this question very seriously, and actually there are significant risks. That sort of started leading me down the train of, oh yeah, actually I think I want to work on this because some of these are substantial, and I think if we don't do anything, might curtail the potential of humanity permanently, which would be a great tragedy, sort of given how large that potential is. In terms of what I think the greatest existential risk is, so sometimes I ask this question, like, what's my favorite existential risk? Which is sort of a funnier question. I'm not, I don't want any of them to occur, of course, but there is this question of sort of what's really interesting. I think the one that's caught my attention over the last few years, especially, actually there have been two. It's hard to choose. So biotechnology, I think, is a fascinating subject because it holds a lot of promise. Disease, aging, sort of like the fundamental problems that face everyone. We're all on this train towards aging and death, and that sucks. No one wants that. But we're all in that train, and the only way we can solve that is by pushing the frontiers of biotechnology. However, I also think that this presents some extraordinary risks. But we're seeing right now a pandemic, and this is a pretty mild pandemic in the space of possible pandemics. Like, there is reason to think that pandemics could be much worse if they were engineered to be much worse. And we've certainly done the work in the past, and when I say we, I mean the US and the Soviet Union and various other biological weapon programs have designed viruses and have designed pathogens to be really deadly. And so this seems like one of the greatest existential threats. And I think, though engineered pandemics are sort of one class of existential risks in the biotech space, they're not the only one. I think it also seems quite possible that you could engineer organisms to sort of rapidly expand and eat up all life around the world. Now, it's not clear how hard that is. But in terms of, is it possible in principle, I think the answer is yes. So I think when I think of the most severe existential risks, I think of biotech and I think AI. And so I'm sure you guys have probably talked a lot about sort of artificial general intelligence and the promise and perils of it. And I pay a lot of attention to this because I think it's really important. But I mean, I think there's a lot of experts in this field that are sort of, that I defer to, Bostrom being one, but like Eliezer Yudkowsky being another, where they've really built out some pretty strong arguments in the field. Now, I think people disagree about timelines. People disagree about sort of takeoff scenarios and how fast you might get, a sort of development of AGI from sort of a less than human level to greater than human level. But I think both in terms of biotech and in terms of AGI, there's a real question here of at the point at which this occurs and becomes really powerful, will we get through it in a way that's good, or in a way that's will we get through it at all? And so it's sort of tricky because like some threats right now are extremely acute. Like I think the risk of nuclear war for the past few decades and for the foreseeable future is much more likely that we'll see a nuclear war in the next decade, I think, than we'll see a huge catastrophe in the biotech space or in the AI space. But I think nuclear war, while would be extremely catastrophic, would be pretty unlikely to cause human extinction. It would set us back a lot. But the probability that it would result in a total existential event, I think, is much lower. So I think biotech and AI are going to be the ones I think are the most severe.
So this is interesting because you have different timeframes for these risks. You would say nuclear war is the greatest risk in the immediate future, but the biotech and artificial intelligence generated risks are more substantial over longer term timeframes. Now, I'm curious if you think there would be a severe disincentive from engineering a pandemic of the sort that could wipe out humankind because of the indiscriminate nature of it. It's even more indiscriminate than nuclear weapons, given that with a nuclear weapon, you could target it at a city and it'll blow up the city, but do less damage to surrounding areas. Whereas with a pandemic, once it's loose, we've seen with COVID-19, you can't really contain it within national borders.
Yeah, I think this is like one of the sort of saving graces of the risks from bioweapons in particular, is that they're kind of terrible weapons. They're not very good weapons. And when you compare biological weapons to nuclear weapons, there's some really stark differences, some of which you're alluding to, right? Like one, you can't control them very well. But it's not even just true that you can't control them. You can't even very easily predict what they'll do. So like, if you design a virus, you might test it in a monkey population, but like monkeys have pretty different immune systems than humans do, and they have different cell receptor types. And you can take, humanized mice and you can test them in humanized mice, but like mice aren't people. So unless you're testing on humans, which is extremely hard to do secretly, you're really not going to have much guarantee. Like you're not going to have like much of a guarantee that your weapon will do what you want it to do. And you'd think, so if every government was rational, if every military was rational, we'd spend very little effort, I think, developing biological weapons. But unfortunately, like military programs respond to their internal incentives, and sometimes their internal incentives do have them create weapons like this. And we saw this in particular during the Soviet Union's biological weapons program. They employed like 40,000 people. They had a huge budget. They made like hundreds and hundreds of tons of anthrax. So it was a very big program, and I think sort of from a rational perspective, it didn't make a lot of sense. It wasn't actually going to be an effective weapons program, but nonetheless it existed. So the danger I see in the biological space is that basically there'll be internal incentives to develop weapons programs like these, even though they don't make that much sense. And then I see the greatest risk is that something goes wrong, as in someone makes a pretty powerful virus and then it gets out, or someone's trying to develop a targeted virus, but they end up making one that's not very targeted and that gets out. Fortunately, I think that that's unlikely to cause human extinction because it actually is just really hard to kill everyone with a virus. People can quarantine. Viruses don't live very long outside human hosts. And so there's a lot of things that I think are sort of favoring our survival in this case. I think where some of the greater risks in terms of biotech come from are a little further out. They're a little further remote, but are potentially more likely to cause human extinction. And those are the ones that significantly alter the environment or significantly alter sort of the substrate on which life currently depends. And those things might be possible with synthetic biology, and we just currently don't know. And so that's sort of that's not in the biological weapon space. It's more in the synthetic biology, bioengineering space, where you might want to make organisms that, say, are like really locally fit in their environment, or just like are extremely good at surviving. And you could accidentally create something that had a really drastic environmental effect.
Yes, thank you for that explanation. And indeed, it seems to me that the greatest problems from engineered pathogens would arise if something went amiss, if an engineered virus, for instance, escaped its containment for whatever reason, and it wouldn't have been the intention of the parties creating it to unleash it, but it could happen. So, as an example, recently the genome of the 1918 Spanish flu virus was published. And I'm curious as to your thoughts regarding the wisdom of doing that. Is it a good idea to publish wholesale information regarding a pathogen that would enable somebody to reverse engineer it? Or should there be safeguards? Should there be limitations on who can access that information? And if so, how should those safeguards be implemented?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I like the 1918 flu question in particular because that was a much worse. Well, it was a moderately worse pandemic than COVID-19, and it's not clear how bad it would be if it was re-released. But I suspect it might be pretty bad, and I suspect it might be worse than COVID. It's why I say it's hard to know is because, well, we have like a lot more air travel now. We have a lot different, circumstances. Though also we're implementing a lot more pandemic preparedness stuff right now, or like preparedness. I actually mean just response, right? Like we're already social distancing. We're already wearing masks. So maybe if someone introduced that right now, it wouldn't actually be that bad. Or maybe it would really compound the pandemic and be quite terrible. But I do think that what I can say is that we haven't done a comprehensive risk assessment, and we also haven't done a economic analysis of sort of what the risks are of releasing information like that. Now, this risk estimate is really hard to do, right? Because you have to say, what are the chances that someone will be working with this sequence, or that will create this virus for legitimate research purposes and then have it escape, or what are the chances that someone will, for malicious use, create this virus and deliberately release it? And these are, it's really hard to, estimate probabilities of things that happen very rarely. But yeah, I think that I'm pretty unhappy with the current. I'm pretty unhappy with the current regulations around this or the current governance around this. My intuition is that for something like the 1918 flu, we should be pretty careful with releasing the sequence. But I think my wider view is that it's not that the object level matters that much. Like there's a lot of other virus sequences that are just readily available that you can download right now. Smallpox, for example. So there's plenty. Like if you wanted to create deadly viruses, we just have, you just go to the internet. There's plenty of deadly virus sequences available to you. My overall concern is just that we don't have a comprehensive approach to this. We aren't like dealing with this in a rational way. We just don't have rational policy around it. Now there are attempts. It's not that the governance communities around this do nothing. They do, and you're supposed to have a review board before you do any gain of function research. Gain of function being giving a virus new capabilities. But I think that like the state of risk assessment in this space is just not very good. And it's interesting because like you can regulate sort of, for example, gain of function research or particular research around virology without slowing down most of biotech. Most of biotech is not concerned with infectious viruses between humans. Like that is an important field of study. But you can regulate that tiny piece of it without touching most of the things that we care about. And so, I think we should, but it's a hard problem.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for answering this question. And I will ask one more question before we go around to the other US Transhumanist Party officers. And this question stems from some of my occasional conversations with conspiracy theorists who say that the COVID-19 virus was artificially engineered in a lab somewhere in China, that it wasn't naturally derived. And my counter argument to them has been essentially one that human beings do not yet have the ability to engineer something, let's say, so wide-ranging in the damage that it inflicts, where it's not just a respiratory virus, it also damages the circulatory system, the digestive system, it does neurological damage, it does all sorts of things, and unpredictably, depending on which individual it afflicts. But what do you think of one, whether that's a persuasive counterargument, two, what would be effective counterarguments against the assertion that this virus was artificially created somewhere by humans?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think there's a lot of like fine distinctions here. So there's, was it artificially created? And there's also the question of, did it originate from a lab? And these are somewhat different questions. Like it's possible that someone collected a bunch of samples from the wild and then something was in a lab and then it got out. That wouldn't be artificial creation, but that would be a lab leak. I don't think the argument that humans couldn't create something like this is persuasive. I think a really persuasive counterargument to this didn't come from a lab would be solid evidence that it came from a bat or an intermediate host. And so this research is ongoing in China right now. I would really like more independent investigators to be let into the country and to be able to do independent analysis, because I think it's really important that we find out where this thing came from. And while I do trust scientists in China to do a good job at this, I don't trust the Chinese administration to let them publish their work in a way that's open. So currently, they are basically requiring anyone who publishes information on the origin of the pandemic to basically get central government approval before publishing. And I see why they want to do that, but also that's not creating a very open scientific environment, and it also creates a situation where the rest of the world can't really trust a lot of that work. However, I do think it's totally possible to find a smoking gun in terms of, wait, we looked in these rats, or we looked in these pangolins, or we looked in these cats or something, and we found a virus that's very similar to SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, but is different in these crucial ways. And we found it circulating in November, in near Wuhan. That would be a slam dunk case of now we know where this thing came from. I think that. So one thing that's clear is that the SARS-CoV-2 doesn't show telltale signs of laboratory manipulation. So if a virus was heavily edited, you would expect to see some signs. You could basically see places that the DNA was sort of patched together. Unfortunately, it's also possible to create viruses in ways that don't show these signs. But it does sort of add a little evidence against that hypothesis by the fact that we don't see any, right? Because if you sort of think about the distribution of viruses that were created, a lot of them will have these signs, some of them won't. So if we don't see any signs, that like reduces that probability a little bit. But I mean, my general approach here is that given that we still don't have the origin, we should keep in mind all hypotheses, including the lab origin one. I think it's very likely that if in the event that it did come from a lab, it wouldn't be a nefarious thing. It would just be sort of normal virology research, where researchers were trying to understand how SARS-like viruses can spill over into the human population. And that wouldn't entail any malicious action. It could be an unfortunate accident. But unfortunately, this is a very hard question to resolve given sort of the current environment in China and in the US. The political environment generally makes this question a really hard one to answer.
Yes, indeed, this question has been politicized, and of course, the notion of an artificial origin has been seized upon by people who either want to use it to inflame tensions with China or allege some sort of New World Order style conspiracy for using this pandemic to control the human population. And I agree, objective discussions of that question are difficult, to say the least. Now, let's hear any questions from the U.S. Transhumanist Party officers. If you have a question for Jeffrey, please go ahead.
Yeah, Jeffrey, I'm curious, how can we go from recognition of the problem of existential risk, the scale of, I don't know, death of our son, or creating rogue AI, towards the solution, the solution of the problem? Because I believe that going through like conventional ways we solve the problem is not gonna bring us any substantial results in that context. Like we cannot, I don't know, create a small startup which gonna raise seed capital and then we're gonna build new sun. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had like a really satisfying answer to it. I think I don't, but I have some thoughts. When I think about this problem or these sets of problems, I usually divide the solution space into two. I think one are what are ways to mitigate the risks? What are ways to sort of patch our current systems? And I think there are a lot of these. One thing it's very notable to me that we haven't had a nuclear war, despite having nuclear weapons since the 40s, despite having this like long multi-decade period of time where two rival superpowers had really high tensions, despite the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there were tactical nukes on Cuban shores, and someone was a Russian submarine almost launched a nuclear torpedo. We've gotten really close, but there have been systems in place that have really mitigated that particular risk. There are 9 nuclear states, which is a lot, but I think the sort of scholars and physicists who are thinking about nuclear proliferation in the 50s thought by this time there would be more than a dozen or more than 24 nuclear powers. And so there has been some sort of like uneasy but real international coordination on the nuclear front to keep us safe, and to sort of, even though there were rivals, people still didn't. No one wanted a nuclear war. So there was some real coordination around these things. No one wants a non-state actor to get a nuke, and so that's in the space of these sort of like patchwork solutions where I think that over time a nuclear war is still a real possibility, because we haven't systemically gotten rid of the risk. The risk is still there, but we have really mitigated it, and that's worth doing. That's good. So I think the same kind of things can be done with AI and with biotech. We have the Biological Weapons Convention, which is a UN structure that attempts to reduce the risk from biological weapons. It's not very good. It's toothless. There's no enforcement mechanisms. It's really political. There's a lot of problems with it. So I would like to see a huge upgrade there. And that would be another patchwork solution, but it'd be a big step in the right direction. With AGI, there are organizations who are working on the technical side, like MIRI, Machine Intelligence Research Institute, and both DeepMind and OpenAI have safety researchers on their team. You had advocacy groups that are working on this. FHI is working on this. You have, there's lots of organizations and lots of people and like, academic and non-academic and all of these things who are working on things to mitigate these risks. And I think they are moving the dial somewhat. But all of these things that I've listed so far, I think, are in this category of risk mitigation, or like basically sort of short-term can we make these systems a little better? Can we basically like mitigate these risks a bit? And I think, as you're sort of alluding to, okay, but like, what about when we need a new sun? Like that's not going to it's not going to be accomplished by like making a slightly more effective body in the UN. And I agree with you. And I think we have to be more creative about better solutions there. And I hope in the long term we can create international institutions that have both sort of the ability and the political power, and I mean like real political power, not symbolic political power, but like actual buy-in from political institutions, and the sort of the knowledge and the ability to do good risk modeling and to come up with real coordination. But I think right now we're at the state where people have imagined things like this, but we're not close to anything like this right now. And I think part of the reason is that there's really strong competition. There's a lot of tensions in the world. The US, China, and Russia are not talking when it comes to a lot of the nuclear stuff that we were talking about 10, 20 years ago. So unfortunately, our state of international coordination has gotten worse. And while that's upsetting, I don't think we should be too discouraged by it, because this is something that will just keep changing. Like the geopolitical environment is a very chaotic one. It changes a lot. And what I think sort of people who have this long-term orientation, I think, can sort of plan for the long term and say, okay, but imagine in the next 50 years, we come up with something that works really effectively at sort of structurally changing things enough so that we can put some real solutions in place. And so my challenge is just like, well, I think now is the time to be really creative in thinking about these structures and be really ambitious in the structures that will be necessary. Like, I think we have to be ambitious because like it's, just like someone, people who are just like, starting nonprofits and just like creating some sort of like advocacy groups, that's not going to be enough. Like it's going to take real power, right? It's going to take like real, a lot of people to buy into this. But I think that the thing that makes me optimistic, even though it's really hard, is that we have a lot of incentive to do this, right? Like everyone wants their children to have a future or their grandchildren to have a future. And it's going to become more and more obvious, I hope, and I think it is sort of with COVID, that like a lot of these things really do threaten our future in a significant way. And if we can't figure out how to coordinate, well, then we have a real problem. So even though we may not see eye to eye on everything, in fact, we may have significant disagreements, I hope that there are enough incentives to collaborate that like people start to come together on this. And so sorry, this is sort of a long-winded answer, but the last thing I'd say on this is that the scientific community in the 40s and 50s, I think, had a really good attitude about this, and they were very ambitious, and they really believed in sort of like, they're like, well, we're facing this existential threat from nuclear weapons, and in order to have a world, we have to figure out how to like collaborate. And they were trying to sort of use the scientific community as a bridge for international collaboration, and they succeeded in some ways. Like I mentioned, sort of some of the nuclear risk mitigation stuff, but overall they failed, right? Like they had this really ambitious vision of a like unified world that would like treat these risks systemically, and they failed at doing that. And I think that sort of we've sort of become jaded and cynical, and we've sort of stopped believing that this is possible. But I think that their original vision was correct, and it's not surprising that they failed. It's a really hard problem, but I think it's time for round two. It's time to like see if we can pick up where they failed and maybe understand why they failed and try to come up with something better.
Yes, thank you. Now, one of the important insights here is, yes, it's true that nobody wants these existential risks to happen, including the leaders of various countries. Certainly, Donald Trump does not want his ability to lead a lavish lifestyle and enjoy all of his Trump properties, etc., to be obliterated by a nuclear war. Vladimir Putin doesn't want his ability to rule in an authoritarian manner over his country to be jeopardized by a nuclear war. So even people like that, who may have other kinds of questionable motives, don't want the obliteration of humanity. And as a result, that can serve as a check. What actually concerns me more are well-meaning academic or theoretical frameworks that could encourage the use of some of these weapons of mass destruction. For instance, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction that was so prevalent during the Cold War, which actually led the world's nuclear arsenals to be on a kind of hair trigger and led a lot of officials to essentially commit to the use of maximally destructive force as a way of establishing a credible deterrent. Whereas had there been, say, a no first strike policy or something along the lines of mutual defense systems, the Ronald Reagan SDI, aka Star Wars initiative, is actually a much more sensible strategy in my view that I would wholeheartedly recommend. But this mutually assured destruction philosophy led it to essentially be rejected in favor of the hair trigger stance that unfortunately both the US and Russia are still engaged in today. So do you see a large area of risk from essentially misguided analytical frameworks that encourage the use of deadly force when it could be averted?
Yeah, well, I think that's sort of an easy yes. And sort of even if we disagree about which analytical frameworks might be good or bad, the risk of sort of bad frameworks being used, I think, is significant. It's also this like tricky, yeah, the nuclear deterrence space is a really, I think, ripe area for study here because it highlights a lot of these things. Like you had a bunch of game theorists coming out of RAND and advising the US government on nuclear strategy. And they were some very extremely smart people, right? You had like Thomas Schelling, Herman Kahn. But the thing is like the people who actually implemented the policy were not these game theorists, right? They were you know, they were politicians. They were people or you know, military generals or whatever. So you had a diverse group of people with their own political interests, with their own social circles, and they end up sort of like, and then you get this like weird ideological drift where like, you know, and so I think that one of the problems with sort of U.S. deterrence theory, well, the two big problems. One, it was insensitive to what the Soviets actually thought. So it was a lot of like highbrow theory about like what a rational agent would think. And they're like, well, we assume that Russia is this rational agent, so they will respond to threats in a rational way, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, well, no, you're dealing with like another country, you're dealing with another culture, you're dealing with another sort of hodgepodge of cultural institutions and theory and all this other stuff with language barriers and all the rest. So there were a lot of assumptions made about what the Soviets thought that just like weren't correct because they were based on sort of this like analytical framework that assumed that the Russians would basically think the same way that that we did. And like that wasn't always true. So that was one problem. And then the other problem was that this idea was that we had to avoid nuclear war at all costs, which on one hand seems kind of sensible because nuclear war is really terrible. But on the other hand, the thing I advocate, and this is not my idea, it's sort of coming out of some conversations I've had with people at RAND, is that you should try to focus on minimizing net systemic risk, which is not a very sexy phrase, but like the idea behind it I think is really good, which is that you shouldn't try to stop something at all cost. You should try to sort of think about the probability of something, and you should think about the severity of something, and then you should try to mitigate that. And so there are some things that you might want to do that might slightly increase the chance of nuclear war, but would greatly reduce the severity of it. And sometimes that's actually the right choice. Whereas if you just minimize the chance of war, you're in for a bad way. So this is like very relevant to the mutually assured destruction question, right? I think that it's a terrible idea to threaten to nuke each other's cities. I think that you should basically take cities off the table and say we will only hit military targets, and like maybe we'll hit a capital or two. Like, I mean, this is all like terrible Holocaust level stuff. And we live in this sort of Kafkaesque world where this is like, unfortunately, the conversations that people in the defense department have every day. It's just it's a world we're in. But given that we're in this world, I think we need to be able to have serious conversations about, no, let's both agree to spare cities. Like we can completely obliterate each other's militaries and economic bases without having to kill hundreds of millions of civilians. Let's leave the civilians out of this. And so some theorists would argue that, well, wouldn't this overall increase chances of nuclear war? And you know what? It might a tiny bit, probably not a lot, but maybe a little bit. But I would just argue that's worth it because the overall risk reduction is significant.
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I have a question for. I was wondering how you see things trending right now, because with nuclear weapons, because on the one hand, we had the START treaty under Obama, and I guess the total numbers are declining somewhat. But then we also see that Trump has increased the budget for our nuclear program, and along with Congress, of course. And then we have a lot of news coming out that there's Russia and China have been developing hypersonic missiles, and now more recently news that the US has been developing those. And those would actually reduce the amount of time they would reduce the amount of time before the detection of the incoming missile and when it strikes its target. So that requires that the countries be even more on a hair trigger, which seems like a really bad development. So I'm wondering, like, why are these countries developing these hypersonic missiles, and like how what is the overall trend? Is things getting better? Are things getting better or worse?
Yeah, that's a really hard question to answer. I'm a little confused about the hypersonic stuff. So I'm just going to say I have looked into this, but I'm not an expert here. Or it's just like a highly specialized field. So hypersonics, even despite their name, aren't actually faster than ICBMs, as far as I know. ICBMs go to space. It's really fast to be in space. You don't have to worry about an atmosphere. Whereas hypersonics sort of skim the top of the atmosphere. I think the advantage of hypersonics is that so they're much faster than missiles normally in an atmosphere. So I think that the advantage there is that I think the main advantage is they're extremely hard to stop with anti-missile systems. With anti-ballistic missile systems.
They're harder to detect coming in because they fly lower to the ground.
Okay. So what you're saying is ICBMs are easier to detect than hypersonics.
Yeah, because they go.
Cool, and they're maneuverable. Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean,
At first, I thought the goal was just like to be a lot faster, but just recently I realized the thing is they because they're low to the ground, they come over the horizon like much closer to you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, cool. So that would reduce things that reduce the amount of time that you have to decide are awful from a perspective of risk, right? Because it just puts way more pressure on decision makers to like launch. And the use it or lose it thing is terrible when you're like, well, we can either fire all of these nukes now or we can lose them. It's really not great. As to why they do it, unfortunately, it's just, I think it's just the game theory of, you don't want to be left behind. You don't want to be the only one whose nuclear arsenal is vulnerable. And I think that so I think the thing I'd say is that this is a bad development. This does increase risk. We are in a worse place now because of it. And I think the way out of it is we need to get back onto to the negotiating table with China and Russia and the US, and we need to say like, hey, we all can develop this technology. It's like, it's all within our capabilities. We are all doing it. And also this is making everything worse for all of us. So like, let's figure out a way that despite, we're going to keep competing, but let's compete in a better way. Let's compete in a way that doesn't have as much risk for all of us. We're not there yet. And that's unfortunate. So until we can get back to that stage, which I think we'll eventually get back to, there are times with the Soviet Union where we weren't willing to go to the table, and then we did, and we came back and we're like, actually, this is pretty bad. So I hope that we get back there, and that's how we can reduce the risk, and we can have conversations about, well, what are ways to maintain deterrence, to have even better, even quieter submarines or whatever, that don't require us to have these faster weapons. So that's my overall
thought. It doesn't seem necessary for just deterrence to have these like. Of course, once one person develops them, then kind of.
They're kind of good first strike weapons, and we shouldn't be developing first strike weapons. That's not.
They're first strike weapons. Yeah, whereas the subs are more. This is second strike weapon, I guess. Another question I had, which is somewhat different, is do we need like a new anti-nuke movement? Because I guess during the Cold War there was this like pretty big anti-nuclear movement, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like people think, well, the Cold War ended, so the threat is gone now. But the big threat all along was, in my mind, someone just causing an accident, or even like people hacking into the system, right? And
Yeah.
I don't think that threat's gone away at all or diminished, because we have the exact same systems all in place that we had in the Cold War. I mean, if you look at those computer systems they're using, they're the exact same, right? So people have just kind of anesthetized to it, and I was just wondering, like, do we need like a new like grassroots movement now? Like, how do we like, and like, would that be useful, or would it be more useful just to like work through high level political channels?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't see. Yeah, grassroots movements seem really hard to model. It seems like really hard to know if you're a grassroots movement, or if you. So one, like how exactly do you do this? And two, will it be effective? Like, will it actually accomplish the goals that you want? And I want to plead a bit of ignorance here, but also claim that most people don't understand this too, including experts on it. So it's a very hard subject. I think for me, tactically, I wouldn't want to put a lot of effort into movement building here, because what I see in the sort of nuclear risk advocacy space, the more sort of popular version of it, is that I see a lot of like not very nuanced conversations and a lot of push for things that aren't necessarily good, in my opinion, that don't really reduce risk, but do make people feel good. Whereas I see the like Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, they do a really good job, and they present a lot of useful analysis, and I think they have high level conversations that are nuanced. So I want to see much more of that. So I think,
yeah, another point is you might actually run into people that I think people want a simple solution, like let's just all get rid of nukes, right?
Well, that is what the U.S. Transhumanist Party advocates.
Yeah.
We do advocate
so I
total
guess I
disarmament.
ask you, like, now personally, I do think that nuclear weapons have a useful role as a deterrent. But I'm curious what you think, Jeffrey, and if you also think that, like, what's the balance? What's reasonable?
I certainly want a world without nuclear weapons, and I'm not sure how to have a stable one. The stability is the problem here, right? So if you manage to get everyone to get rid of all of their nuclear weapons, what's to stop people from building one in 6 months? Well, not a lot, unfortunately. They're not that hard to make. And so, I mean, they're hard, but like they're the kind of thing that you can make them in 6 months. And so if you saw an increase in hostilities, and then you might just have another arms race. Now, I do think the world would be much safer if we just had way less of them. You could still do a lot of damage with a few nuclear weapons. And so I'm a pretty big fan of like, let's reduce to less than 1,000 each, or like, even less than 500. I think, with nuclear submarines and a few missiles, I think you could really do a real deterrence given that. I think that in terms of the long-term solutions, what I would really like to see is, eventually to get to a nuclear-free world. I don't know what would be required for that in terms of like what kind of coordination structure would need to exist. Maybe this gets into the AI space of like, well, once we have agents that are much more capable of individual humans, or once we have autonomous systems. I mean, not that I want to trust that right away, like, right, like that's a whole other conversation. But I do think that there might be solutions in the future that we can get to that just won't require deterrence anymore. But that's a pretty like beyond the horizon type line of thinking.
Well, it's interesting because the U.S. Transhumanist Party in its platform states that we support multilateral attempts at disarmament if at all possible, because that seems to be the most effective approach without side effects. But even if the U.S. had to disarm unilaterally, we would support that. And for instance, a shift toward defense. What do you think about the idea of essentially a great power like the United States becoming an anti-nuclear state, where not only does it disarm, but it actively tries to seek out and destroy nuclear weapons wherever they might arise. So, for instance, if the US were to create a space-based nuclear defense system that was highly effective at intercepting them, to the point where any nuclear weapon fired at the US would just be shot down. At the same time, the US would essentially send out agents throughout the world to identify any rogue individuals or terrorist networks that try to develop nuclear weapons and get rid of the weapons, also pressure other governments to get rid of their nuclear weapons, create situations where a government that chooses to maintain its nuclear stockpile, while there wouldn't be war against that government, could become an international pariah in other respects. Could that kind of approach work? Unilateral disarmament followed by intense pressure on other countries to disarm, as well as development of defensive systems to show that their nuclear weapons are not going to be that effective anyway.
Yeah, so there's a number of sub-questions here. One, I think, is how effective could anti-nuclear defense systems be? Another one is, could unilateral disarmament be good or be useful? And then sort of another one is like, how much pressure how much sort of non-nuclear posturing pressure, sort of like economic pressure or other kinds of pressure, can the US put on other states in order to disincentivize nuclear weapons? So I think, unfortunately, I think in terms of the first question, I think it's pretty unlikely that the US will be able to develop systems of defense that, or anti-ballistic missile defense or other kinds of nuclear defense that will lead to high effectiveness defense against nuclear weapons. It's an arms race. And so there's this question of, what is the offense versus defensive advantage? And for any given technology, there will be some sort of natural fallout of how hard this is, right? And if we look through history, look at weapon systems, we can see like, well, castles were really great defensively. They basically were like OP. A lot of people were just able to hold up in castles for a long time with lots of food, and like a siege is really expensive. You have to have like big supply lines and all this stuff. So castles just were really great defensively for a long time, and then of course you develop gunpowder, and now you can blow out castle walls, and suddenly they're not very effective anymore. And so I think with nuclear weapons, this story has mostly been one of pretty offensive dominated landscape. And to start out, we already had these long range bombers that were really effective, and then we developed ICBMs, then we developed subs, and we developed maneuverable reentry vehicles. We developed other sorts of countermeasures, electronic warfare countermeasures. And then on the defensive side, we also have a lot of developments too, right? We have like we also have really good missiles that can seek out other missiles. We have we're working on high energy weapons like lasers. We're working on better space defense stuff. So you can make bets as to how this offensive defensive asymmetry will change. But where I would put my bets is that offensive is going to continue to dominate, because a lot of the same advances that help defense also help offense, and so it's kind of a wash. That's my own take. This is a hard question. It's a multi-billion-dollar question. A lot of people are working on this, but I'm not super optimistic about solving it. But in terms of unilateral disarmament, I think there's a lot we can do unilaterally that would make the world a lot safer. I think our current deterrent is overkill. It's extreme overkill. We're talking about, we can wipe out hundreds of millions of people if we need to. And we don't need to do that. Like, you can threaten someone. You can threaten someone in a pretty big way. Like, you can threaten all the leaders of the world without having to threaten the millions of civilians that they don't even necessarily care about in this space, right? So you can have a very effective nuclear deterrent without needing to have the ridiculous overkill that we have now, and we could do that unilaterally. I also think that if we did this, we should try to use that disarmament as a show of good faith to bring people back to the negotiating table. I think it would be sort of a missed opportunity if we didn't do that. And so even though I'm not optimistic that we could get to zero, I think we could get to a much lower number. And I think that we could, in my perfect world, Transhumanist Party, has a lot more influence in U.S. politics and is able to change, alter the nuclear platform. We get much more disarmament, and we get much more U.S.-led efforts to make the world safer from nuclear weapons. I think that would be fantastic.
Yes, indeed. At the very least, reversing the trajectory would be highly desirable.
Yeah.
And it has happened in the past. In the 1980s, under Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, the US greatly decreased its nuclear stockpile and enabled the Soviet Union to do the same. It's just unfortunately with the recent geopolitical tensions that has reversed in a major way.
Another thing I just want to throw in that maybe not many people know is that when we did all that disarmament and disassembled the nuclear weapons, we actually kept, I believe, all of the plutonium. And so and the plutonium and I guess uranium, heavy uranium, is the time limiting factor for building nukes. So because we have all the plutonium, which they call pits, they could actually rebuild everything, ramp up everything in maybe 6 months. So that
you're not going to rebuild all the weapon systems, right? You're not going to like suddenly build like a bunch more ICBMs in that time. So I agree with you regarding warheads, but
and a lot of these are in a place called Plano, Texas, I believe. I learned this like 10 years ago, so maybe it's different now, but that's how it was. And so I think I think Russia also has a lot of plutonium. So maybe what we could do is start converting that plutonium into like clean energy. What about that?
Yes, that was my thought as well. If there's a way to repurpose this fissile material as fuel for nuclear power plants,
we have the technology actually. It's just there's a lot of like the technology for burning plutonium was developed like in the 60s.
Did Russia keep all their plutonium too? Presumably.
I don't know about Russia. I know that the US has a lot of it in this Plano, Texas facility. So I just think that's a really interesting thing because it means that the disarmament was not as complete as it may appear.
Yeah, that's a good point. We should get rid of that. But it's also useful. Yeah, it's like useful for power. So.
Did you have a question, Gennady?
I wanted to see if Art Ramon had a question.
It's more along the biological lines. Do you see any threat from like genetic conditions like autism that seem to have a high degree of correlation with high intelligence? So that it continues to increase, all the time. Is it possible that in the future, as people gain greater intellect, their children are becoming susceptible to autism and anything like that?
Yeah, I think. I think this is like a really complex area, and like behavioral genetics is still trying to figure a lot of this stuff out. And also, it's like also a politically very like toxic topic, as in it's very hard to have conversations about it. I think with a sort of good scientific lens. I do think that we should. I do think that we should be concerned about the sort of long-term future as it relates to human health, and I think genetics is like a really important part of that. I think that in an ideal future, we would have the ability to improve ourselves, right? Like that we would have the ability to use advances in biotech to make humans healthier. And I think one of the things is the way I try to approach this is that there are some things that are really controversial, and there are some things that are just like most people are just going to agree with if you frame it correctly. You're like, oh, do you want your children to have better immune systems? Like maybe there's some people that will take the hardline stance of like, no alteration is unnatural. But if you're like, well, your children's going to get sick half as often if you go with this change, and you ask a parent that, most parents are going to be like, yeah, let's do that. And if you're asking your parent, hey, do you want your parent to have Down syndromes or do you want them to not have Down syndromes? What parent's going to choose Down syndrome? So I hope that we can I hope that basically we can move this in the direction of first, just like, let's have healthier children. And I think that's not going to be a big controversy. I do think we should talk about enhancements, because I think this could really raise the standard of living for everyone in the world by having enhancements. I think the obvious thing to do, like the easiest win on the table, is just improving health. It's much more complicated when we talk about autism or we talk about deafness, because there are communities. I think that with autism there are lots of advantages of high functioning autism, and so I certainly wouldn't want to get rid of that. I think it's actually very useful in a lot of ways, and I think a lot of people who are really happy who have high functioning autism. So I think that one I would say, there's going to be tricky conversations here, right? Because the deafness is another example where, like, most people think of deafness as an impairment, but there's a whole community around it, and those people would be pretty upset if you suddenly got rid of sort of their existence, or like the way that they exist, right? They're like, well, there's something valuable about that, and so I don't want to tell people what's valuable to them, but I do want to give people choices, and I do want to give people the ability to be able to make choices about the sort of what their children's potential can be, and so it's complex. I don't have great answers, but I think we should definitely go in the direction of healthier, better humans.
All right, excellent. And
Um,
I think, go ahead, Dan.
Well, to switch topics now, I noticed that Mike Lazine and someone else, I think, in the chat were discussing lethal autonomous weapons. And I think we'd be remiss not to discuss that risk. That's something the US Transhumanist Party has gotten interested in recently. So I'm wondering, I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about that? Lethal autonomous weapons, and is it more of a small risk, like a catastrophic kind of terrorist, something like a terrorist attack, or is it like at the level of nukes?
It certainly interfaces with the nuclear risk a lot. So the Russians have an alleged autonomous nuclear weapon system that is, I think, fully autonomous, or can be fully autonomous, according to what they claim. I think it's called, codenamed Poseidon or something. Sort of hilariously, I think they had like a poll. They're like, what should we call this new weapon system? No, Poseidon. Okay, that's Russia, I guess. Fascinating world we live in. So what it is it's a like I don't know, 50 to 100 megaton warhead. And this is all like what they say. I don't know if this is true, but this is sort of what they claim. And it's launched from another kind of submarine, and then it just sort of goes along the ocean floor and then goes to a coast, and then it explodes near a coast. And it's supposed to be fully autonomous. So that's a pretty interesting one, where there's already a major nuclear power that claims to have an autonomous nuclear weapon system, and even if that's not true, we should still take that claim seriously, and we still have to talk about what that means for the world. I don't think this weapon system is like particularly impressive in terms of like adding a lot to deterrence or second strike capability. I think it's more likely showmanship or just sort of posturing. But I do not like the trend of having autonomous nuclear weapon systems. There's of course the security concern. No system is unhackable, and you can try to make systems really secure, but that often involves a lot of assumptions, and people get it wrong. So I really don't want to be in a world where some non-state actor or some other state actor can hack a nuclear weapon system, create a false flag attack, and then start a nuclear war. That would be extremely bad. And the more automated we make nuclear systems, the more likely this becomes. And then, of course, there's lots of, the same question sort of comes up with non-nuclear weapon systems, where if they can be remotely controlled, you can also stage false flag attacks that way, and you could also start a hot war. And then there's sort of the non-state actor question of how will autonomous lethal weapon systems impact offensive defensive asymmetry? How much will it empower non-state actors against state actors? And that's a little outside of my area of expertise. I'm certainly interested in it. I think.
Well, I don't think it's such a new thing. I don't think there are any real experts on it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all like just happening right now.
Yeah.
There is an organization in Great Britain that's come out against, that's called Campaign for Killer Robots.
Yeah.
Which is trying to push for some international agreements to suspend development, but it's all
It's
happening
the campaign.
right now.
It's the campaign to stop killer robots.
Yeah, it's a campaign to stop killer robots. I'm not sure what I said, but yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that this there are a lot of incentives to push this direction. So I think I did a presentation on this at a Foresight event last year, and it was fascinating because all I was doing basically was like, oh, I'm going to go through Wikipedia and I'm going to look up a list of, I think it was drone, like autonomous drones, like so offensive weapon, so like things like the U.S. has a newer one called the Reaper. Similar, very similar design as to Predator, but like a bit newer. But basically, you're talking about these like there's two categories. One is sort of the loitering ones that sort of like can just stay up for a really long time, and then can launch missiles at whoever. And then the other ones are these newer sort of like stealth autonomous flying platforms. And it sort of makes sense why you want more autonomous capability for stealth, because you can make them smaller. They don't have the same human constraints. They can be out longer. But we're seeing this like take off in terms of autonomous aircraft, and I think that they're in not too long they're going to eclipse human capabilities in terms of pilots. And so pilots might be a thing of the past in terms of military aircraft. Yeah, this is really concerning, right? Like I think there are some people have arguments of like, well, maybe this will make them more reliable because humans have a propensity to error. But I think that's there's a lot of a burden to demonstrate that that's true. And just general arms races like these, I'm not super thrilled about. And taking humans out of the loop, I'm not super thrilled about. And then this is also going to be a trend in submarines as well. So it also makes a lot of sense why you'd want, the ocean's really big. If you can have a lot of autonomous subs, you can really, probe more of the ocean floor. And the thing that concerns me a little bit here is that this could threaten the sort of nuclear submarine capabilities. If you can have like a really big sensor network that's autonomous in the ocean, that this might, plus advancement in machine learning. I'm basically a bit worried that in the oceans we will erode the stealth advantage. I think the stealth advantage makes the nuclear situation more stable. But I don't know enough about it. I'm not a physicist. I'm not a machine learning person. I don't know enough about it to know how much of a concern this is. But I'm a little concerned about it.
Yes, and I think all of us at the U.S. Transhumanist Party are concerned about it. We do have a platform plank in opposition to autonomous weapons, in part because the dangers of an algorithm deciding whom to kill could be greater than the dangers of a human deciding whom to kill. Now, humans admittedly can be biased, they can be emotional, but an algorithm can have essentially a programming error or some sort of criterion for identifying as threats entities that are not genuine threats. And then if you don't have a human check on it, you don't even have common sense. So somebody could really hate someone of a different group, for instance, but they'll spare a little old lady. For example, whereas the algorithm could, for some reason, decide, anything that moves in the following way is a threat, even if it's a little old lady. And that, in some ways, would be a lot more difficult to avert once that capability is out there in the field.
Another concern here is just the potential ease of assassination. I worry a lot about non-state actors getting access to pretty powerful anti-personnel drones and then using those for assassinations. Like we've already seen an attempt. And as the tech gets better, I could see that assassination becoming a thing that you can buy easier. I think right now it's actually hard to buy assassination because there aren't a lot of people who are willing to do it. It's extremely risky. Most people don't want to risk their life for something. But if you can get a drone to do it, maybe that reduces the risk a lot. And then just like, if that leads to way more leaders being assassinated, that leads to a lot more political instability. That's just like a less good world.
Yes, agreed. Now, one more question on the subject of existential risk before we transition to COVID-19. And this question comes from Mike DeVerde, and he's asking whether you've worked with the Lifeboat Foundation in any capacity, or if you're aware of their work in the area of existential.
Yeah, I'm familiar with them. I haven't worked with them directly, or I think I know some people who are on their board, or like I've worked with those people, but I haven't worked with them directly. I'm not really quite sure what they're up to these days, but I'd be totally curious to learn more about that.
Yes, they have a Facebook group which is quite active, and their website is quite active. I would consider them an allied organization of the US Transhumanist Party. They will often reshare some of our content. I wouldn't be surprised if this virtual Enlightenment Salon ended up on their website. I certainly hope so. It's a highly relevant conversation to their work. But it does seem that the depth with which the transhumanist community is addressing existential risks has increased in recent years, justifiably so, given the spectrum of existential risks facing us. But of course, we also have a milder but more immediate risk in the pandemic that the world is currently experiencing. And you've done a lot of work in various aspects of studying COVID-19. In April, you were a guest at the Foresight Institute Salon, where you discussed contact tracing and various possibilities of implementing it while respecting individual privacy. And I'm curious as to what your most recent research in this area has focused on, and how you think the world has handled the pandemic thus far compared to your expectations 6 months ago. Do you think the outcome has been better than you anticipated, worse than you anticipated, about as you anticipated? What is different about the reality from where we would be at this stage?
Yeah, so I'd say that the US has performed worse than I expected, sort of from the beginning. And now I think my expectations are about calibrated with reality, but it took a while, for unfortunately. The US, I think the US still has the most cases in the world. And it's surprising that we're the richest country in the world, but also have had one of the poorest responses. And it's also interesting because we have I think we have the best biotech in the world, right? So we have the best technology that should help us deal with this, and yet we're doing it. We have one of the worst responses. So that's super interesting. I think I was very surprised that China was able to really curtail spread, and I think part of it is that they have a number of structural advantages that I don't love in a lot of ways, but do help them in this situation. And then, I think, say, South Korea, Taiwan, New Zealand, these countries all did very well. Of course, they have some advantages. Taiwan and New Zealand are islands. South Korea is basically an island. And it's really helpful to be able to control your borders, but also having a society that has high trust and that has a pretty competent people in government and in public health. So I think one thing that I take away from all these things is that it really matters who you have in government. Like, it really matters what the incentives are in terms of like where your best people go. And this is sort of like armchair speculation as opposed to rigorous analysis. But I think what happened, or at least in, like, say, South Korea, is that in that society, there is a much better pipeline between, say, your really excellent people at universities and government positions, where I think they just end up with more talent going that direction. Whereas I think in the US, you have more talent going into private institutions, into businesses. It wasn't always that way too. I think that this changed a lot between World War II and now. But I think as a result, not saying that we don't have good public officials. I think we do have some good ones, but I think overall we're just not as competitive as other countries in this aspect. And I think that led to, I saw a lot of good ideas coming out of spaces in the US, and including with contact tracing, where, one of the ones was, well, everyone is carrying around a smartphone and it has Bluetooth, and we could basically, record it, the phones locally could record every transaction, every interaction they had with people. And they didn't have to upload that to some server. They could just keep track of it locally. And then if someone got sick, they could upload sort of a anonymized interactions, and anyone who had interacted with them could see that, that was them. And so this was sort of an obvious technical solution, which is exactly the kind of thing the US is great at. This is one of our strengths, right? Is we can come up with stuff like this. We can do the research. We can do the implementation really well. But unfortunately, the distribution system of something like this requires, some kind of authority or some kind of very persuasive, public health authority to be able to say, hey, everyone go implement this thing. And also you have to have a population that trusts those authorities well enough to say, actually, this is a good idea. I can actually download this thing on my phone. It will be safe and it won't compromise my privacy, and it will actually work. We don't have either of those things. So, we have slowly gotten some progress on this. So I advise COVID Watch, which is one of the groups working on this. And they have, several pilot trials in different universities. They're working with several states, and I think, and then there's different groups within the U.S. that are working on this and who have gotten approval to launch these apps in different states. I think New York. I think there's one in New York that currently is approved. I also was in a lot of calls with the Google and Apple. With the Google and Apple teams, who are basically approving apps for the App Store and trying to work on this process. So they basically had to create a whole new API within their operating systems on Android and iOS so that these apps could function, because Bluetooth wasn't designed to work with this way, and they were sort of not allowing it before. And I was really impressed by those teams. Those teams were, I think they were really tracking the problem. They actually just really cared about implementing a solution that would help people. And so, it was really cool to see some teams within those companies that were just on the ball, totally trying to do the best thing they could, very sensitive to privacy, very sensitive to effectiveness. And it was really cool to see that. But then, that just didn't translate into results, because I think you had to go through these bottlenecks of public health authorities, which are, not very well organized in the United States. They're all sort of disparate and decentralized. You have different states that have their own different thing going on. The CDC didn't step up and didn't present a lot of leadership. The Trump administration totally fell on its face, unfortunately. We just didn't get an effective, organized policy response, which is what we really needed. So despite all of these advantages we have in tech and biotech, we weren't able to deliver and get results in the way that we wanted to. So, and I have less experience with the other countries, but I can look at their case numbers and see that they're way lower. And I suspect a lot of this is because they did have coordinated health responses, and they were able to utilize some of these technologies, and they were able to test more. And then I think that just does work if you can do it.
Do you think that the two-party system in the United States and the politicization of science, as well as the polarization of the general society, contributed to this lack of effective coordinated response? Because we're now at the point where essentially many Republicans have become anti-maskers and many Democrats have become anti-vaxxers, and both are profoundly anti-science positions. Do you think that has impeded a recognition of what measures would objectively work to halt the spread of COVID-19, irrespective of one's political views?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just almost certainly true. And I don't know how much, so some of it is due to polarization. And I think that the mask stuff in particular, the fact that you have, so I took a road trip a couple months ago where I live in Oakland, and I drove up through the West Coast, and so we went all the way up to Seattle, and then we went to Idaho, northern Idaho. And along the way, we went through some towns, we went through some really rural parts, and you saw this difference. The rural parts were one restaurant had a sign up that said, "Don't yell at us for requiring you to wear masks. We're just trying to stay safe and do our job. Blame the government if you want to blame someone. We're just doing what we have to do." But the fact that they had to put up that sign, this was in rural Oregon somewhere. The fact that they had to put up that sign suggested they were getting a lot of pushback from people, and a lot of people were saying, we don't trust this, we don't want to do this. What's up with that? And I'm not sure that that's the result of polarization. I think that might have something to do with it. But there's also there's also a lot of, just stuff like this in American culture. So I think the fact that we have a culture that's very independent and is somewhat suspicious of government to start with makes this a lot harder. As I got further to sort of eastern Washington and towards northern Idaho, I started to see people in stores that sometimes the stores would require people to wear masks, and people would be like, I'm not wearing a mask, and there'd be arguments between employees and people. And I think you see this in the US much more than you see in other countries. But then it was very interesting crossing the border between Washington and Idaho, where like very quickly it went from most people were wearing masks to most people weren't. And stores were requiring masks to stores were no longer requiring masks. So in northern Idaho, the Idaho state government recommended people wear masks, but they didn't require it. And there were clearly a lot of people who were like, "This is dumb. We're not going to do this. We don't, And I can't help but think that is a political difference, and that is a polarization difference, where as the Republican Party, you sort of just went harder on this of like, no, we're going to push back against this thing. And this was just like a cultural piece, which I think is very unfortunate because whether you wear a mask or not shouldn't be what party you're a part of. That's like extremely stupid. Like the virus doesn't care what party you're a part of, right? Same with vaccines, right? Whether the vaccine is safe has nothing to do with what political party you are. And unfortunately, it seems like our ability to sort of as a society deal with scientific information has not increased with the advances in science. So I do think that in terms of what we know now, in terms of at the sort of centers of excellence of research has gone up tremendously, right? The fact that we can sequence a virus very quickly, within weeks of the outbreak in Wuhan, we were able to get a full genome sequence of the virus. That took months for SARS in 2000 for SARS. And the fact that we have 20 different vaccines in the pipeline is amazing. We have new types of vaccines. We're working on mRNA vaccines, which maybe will be able to be developed in the future much faster because they don't rely on protein engineering, which is much more complicated, right? We have so many advances in terms of the actual fundamental science, but I don't think we've made any progress. In fact, I think we've maybe reversed progress in terms of the ability of our society to understand complex questions. And I think in the past, I sort of naively assumed that as sort of this one capacity got greater, the other capacity would get greater too, right? Like if scientists understood more, wouldn't that also mean that the general population would understand more? And it appears the answer to that is no. And that it's just sort of an interesting question of why that is. I think polarization is a big part of it, and sort of information warfare just becoming worse. There's this whole question about how social media and the internet and all of these things have interacted to also create these environments. But yeah, no, I think there's a bunch here that we should be paying attention to in terms of how do we go forward given a sort of very polluted information environment.
Yes, indeed. And that is what concerns me most, the social response to the pandemic. I gave a presentation at the VSIM 2020 conference. It was a virtual conference with a lot of my fellow transhumanists in Bulgaria, Dr. Angel Marchev Sr. and Dr. Angel Marchev Jr. put this conference on every year. And I stated that COVID-19 is a man-made crisis. Of course, I believe the virus is of entirely natural origin, but the reason why this pandemic has plunged the world into a crisis is entirely the fault of the human response or lack thereof in certain contexts, as well as the tremendous furthering of polarization, divisiveness, toxicity that the situation has brought about. And at the same time, I agree, the scientists have done amazing work. The technology is definitely advancing. The medical professionals have done exceptional work in treating people with the knowledge that they had at various stages of this pandemic. So we have a lot of highly competent people. We have a lot of highly educated people in our society. There's no evidence that humans are any worse intellectually than they were, say, 20 years ago. And yet we are experiencing essentially societal breakdown at this stage. And I am curious regarding your insights, as well as anyone's insights more generally, about how we can reverse this destructive social course in the near future.
Yeah, I might open the floor to other people. I mean, it's a great question. I'm not sure I know how to do this.
I just saw the documentary, The Social Dilemma on Netflix.
I did as well.
And they make a very compelling case that this polarization is that largely due to social media. And I think Facebook is the biggest offender here. One of the things is it's easier to target people. It's easier to feed people ads when they are very ideological, like they're easier to manipulate via algorithms. And then the other thing was that like fake news, just by the nature of it, spreads a lot faster than real news on these platforms. And I don't think these platforms have done a good job of countering fake news, which would be in the interest of their users, because they just fundamentally don't have the interest of their users that much at heart. So I think people need to start realizing the dangers of social media and like how they're being manipulated by social media and their filter bubbles and things like that. That's and personally, I've stopped using Facebook almost completely.
I have a question.
I watched The Social Dilemma as well a few days ago, and my thoughts are twofold. I agree there are these perverse incentives built into social media infrastructures. At the same time, it would be sad to lose a lot of the benefits of connectivity and the ability to coordinate worthwhile endeavors that certainly social media have helped to facilitate. So how do we disentangle the good from the bad?
I think they can be used in like a healthy way, but it requires a lot of like self-awareness about and a lot of understanding about how these systems work and the how they can be addictive and things like that. But I do think they can be. That's why I didn't delete my Facebook account. Like I still use it, but and I don't plan to delete it. But I've drastically curtailed my use, and I honestly recommend other people do as well.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty. I feel pretty confident that like the at least low level like believed sort of where people are at is like people will continue to use social media overall. Now, I think that like it is really useful to encourage people to have healthy habits and encourage people who can opt out or who want to opt out. But it's very unlikely to me that like this will just go away. And so I guess part of my question here is, well, I think that there are lots of perverse incentives for social media companies. They are also monopolies in a way that is both sort of can be a problem, but also an opportunity in that they have tremendous influence and they have tremendous ability to alter how news feeds works, how algorithms work, and they're taking huge PR hits from the fact that people are sometimes really miserable on their platforms or who are sort of addicted or all the information commons breaking down. And I just wonder, I think part of what I think is happening is that we don't actually know how to, this is also new, this is like humans are so complex, human culture is so complex that we don't actually know, even if someone was super, with the best incentives and who was very benevolent, was in charge of social media or in charge of Facebook or in charge of Twitter, I'm not sure they actually know what would be required in order to like have healthy interactions be the default or the norm, and how to avoid polarization. So I like sort of hope that I'm sure some people are working on this, but I hope that like that work can be done and be made legible enough that we can have something to point to say like, hey, Facebook, hey, Twitter, you need to do these things, or like you need to like go down these paths. And I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, I want to say like I'm not totally doom and gloom about social media because the users, the companies will respond to the if users start leaving the platform or drastically curtailing their use, the companies will respond to that. I mean, we say that they're beholden to the advertisers first, but they require the users to be on there as well. And so I do think they are going to respond. I mean, right now there is a lot. I have just seen a lot of people waking up to the problems of social media and trying to cut down usage. And I do think companies will respond to that. And I think Twitter has done a few things. They try to counter the filter bubbles, but it's very much like you said, a work in progress. But one thing they could, personally, what I think would be maybe good would be cracking down on the number of sock puppet accounts. But that is hard, and anonymous accounts. But then the downside of that is there are a lot of people who, for various reasons, want to be anonymous, and they might be under an oppressive regime and fear for their own safety if they had to reveal their name. And so I do think there's an important role for anonymous accounts, but at the same time, like they need to like try to cut down on these Russian sock puppet accounts.
Well, I don't know to what extent the Russian sock puppet accounts are really as much of a problem as they're portrayed as being. Yes,
well,
whatever I'm sure
there's a lot of these bots on these
right.
sites, especially Twitter, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And yes, there are bots, but I think a discerning person could differentiate a bot from a real human just by patterns of behavior. I think the bigger problem is how actual humans sometimes treat each other on social media, and the fact that sometimes people with various personality issues tend to have more time to engage in social media posting as compared to the proportion that their activity comprises real world, physical world behaviors. So whereas in the physical world, you might encounter 1 out of 1,000 people with serious personality problems or nefarious motives, on social media, it might be 1 out of 50 people. And those people, if you let them into a group, for example, they tend to pollute the discourse in that group, or they'll try to polarize other people who might be more well-meaning, but they fall for some ploy of this nefarious person. So I am more concerned about that than about bots. I think bots are like spammers. If you receive a bunch of spam emails saying, I'm Prince so-and-so, I have a multi-million-dollar inheritance I want to share with you, you're probably going to figure it out for the scam that it is. But if it's a real person who is actually sophisticated in various misbehaviors, that's more of a problem. And unfortunately, social media do seem to be conducive to that.
Well, just real quick, like one of the issues with bots is there's just so many of them now that they can make it appear as certain movements have more support than they actually do. So like, I think there's some reports say like over 50% of Donald Trump's followers are bots. I don't know if that's true, but people say that. So that's.
So it's a very.
But of course, people could educate them. People, if people are educated, that this wouldn't be such a problem. But it's hard to educate millions of people on all these slight issues. So I wish the platforms would just get them a little more aggressive.
So it's interesting. It's also an arms race, right? Where like the platforms don't want bots, but they also
that's true. AI is getting more human-like.
That's what I was going to bring up. Yeah, and this also strikes me as a very interesting discussion around transhumanism, right? Because like one of the things that we are, it's not just that there are bots and there are humans. There are bots, and then there are everything in between, right? Where you have a human who's managing a bot army, where they're writing most of the content, and they're having their bots post the content that's human written. So you're like, was this written by a human? And you're like, yeah, it was written by a human, but it was posted by a bot. So and this is only going to get worse, right? Like, look at GPT-3. The capabilities of GPT-3, in most cases, to my eyes, pass the Turing test of I can't tell it was written by GPT-3 versus a human. Now, if it's I could distinguish an essay written by Dan then I can't versus an essay written by GPT-3 because I can look at the intellectual claims, I can like take it apart. But if it's just like a paragraph about some random topic, no, I can't tell. And I'm a pretty sophisticated observer, right? I spend a lot of time thinking about what I read, and I think a lot of time spend a lot of time even looking at what GPT-3 specifically outputs. And so given that, I think we are, this is GPT-3, it's not GPT-4 or 5. So given that we're in this place where we're at a really interesting time in history where like we're now getting to the point where algorithmically created content can look like human content. And so I don't know where it's going to go from here. I hope we can use this in a way that's really useful. But of course, there are some serious risks that this could, very, very much further pollute the information commons. So what do you guys think of that?
Well, it's interesting. There's a GPT-3 based AI philosopher that one can consult on various questions. Like you can actually go to this site for the AI philosopher and ask it questions like, do you believe free will is real? Or do you believe that the universe is objective? And it will put out some sort of answer that one might analyze or disagree with or pick apart, but on the surface, it seems like a plausible answer that someone of some philosophical persuasion would give. So this is potentially, at the very least, a gold mine for high school students or undergraduate students who want to, let's say, get some sort of easy grade on a paper, or even if they don't strictly cheat, they might consult this AI philosopher in preparation for an exam, for example. And I would, of course, argue that the quality of that preparation would be suboptimal, but I wouldn't be surprised if some students with fewer moral scruples might utilize these kinds of apps. I remember back when I was a college student, I would publish a lot of my papers from various courses on a site that no longer exists called Associated Content, where I could monetize them based on how many views they got. And I published these papers just as a way of spreading information. Like, I did this research, and I thought, well, why should I just leave the paper sitting in my drawer or on my computer? I want people to benefit from the work that I did. And sometimes I would get strange comments on my papers like, I want this to have more information about some very specific subjects that it was apparent these were students who were assigned to research them for a course. And I was wondering, okay, couldn't you just go and, in addition to reading my paper, read something else, do your own independent research? But it felt like they were looking for, let's say, some easy source that they could do more than just cite. So that's some implication of this kind of GPT-3 language that I foresee, that there might be academic dishonesty attempts by certain students.
Well, it's like Jeffrey said, it's like an arms race. So, theoretically, there could be an AI system for teachers that would detect, AI created content versus human created content. But it's this arms race dynamic where the countermeasures are just barely keeping up with the latest technology. I mean, I just think that, like I said, the social media companies need to be doing more. Another thing that Twitter could do is have more verification. Like, they used to have those verification marks that show like this is a real person. Like, and they had promised that they were going to roll. They had a period where they had rolled that out for everyone, right? But then they shut it down pretty quickly, and they've been promising to start to re-implement that. And I think it's about time that they did.
This is the blue checkmark thing, right?
The blue check marks, yeah.
Yeah. Well, now it's become its own thing, but yeah.
I mean, now it's like, right now it's like a status symbol, because initially only like the really famous people got them, and then it was available for a short amount of time, and so people who were really in the know got it. But so it's like a status symbol, but really what they've been talking about is just opening it up to everyone.
Oh man! So so we've been talking about will people use this to fake homework and such. I was talking about this on Twitter with some people, and some high school students commented, "Yeah, we are already doing this," and like they said that they used GPT-2 to write some of their homework, and that they were certainly going to use GPT-3 for it. So it's not only is this a hypothetical thing, like it's already happening.
GPT-2 wasn't really that good. But,
and yet, yeah. They said it was actually quite helpful for them, and they were able to. I mean,
3 seems like way more advanced than 2. I mean, 2, yeah, but anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. But I'm just pointing out that if you can use 2 for it, you can use. I mean, you can definitely use 3 for it. And yeah, this is. I think this will be an arms race in terms of detection. So right now, if you are very savvy, you could detect whether something was written with GPT-3 by doing language analysis. You can see they use particular words much more so than other words, based on sort of this frequency that they appear on the internet. And humans don't write like that. So you could detect it, but like, is a teacher right now going to be savvy enough to do that? No. And so, and by the time teachers get savvy enough to do that, I'm sure you can tweak your neural network to be slightly better at that. So yeah, it will be a very interesting arms race in terms of detection versus generation.
Mm-hmm. Kids these days, here we are. We're futurists. We're talking about potentialities for this technology to be misused, and they're already doing it. They don't have to wait for us to speculate. Perhaps in 10 years, we will be speculating about some future misuse of this technology, and some kids who by that point might be 30, 40 years younger than some of us, they'll say, well, what are you talking about? We've been doing this since we learned how to speak. We've been using these technologies to circumvent your expectations of what the world is. But indeed, it is quite amusing at the very least to know that this is already being done. Now, I wanted to make sure, Jeffrey, that you got a chance to discuss your research as to the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States, as well as where it could have spread from, because as we know, based on even high-profile publications like the Wall Street Journal recently, this virus was in the United States a lot earlier than most people became alarmed about it, certainly a lot earlier than the shutdowns in mid-March. There were some cases even traced back as far as January of 2020. But what have your studies shown in this regard?
Yeah, I think that's approximately right. I believe there were some cases in January. This is an interesting case of a pretty severe government failure, unfortunately. I remember being totally enraged in February when we knew that there was person-to-person transmission happening in the United States, but we didn't know how much, and we couldn't know how much because, so the first thing that happened was the CDC developed a diagnostic test, a PCR-based test, and they messed it up. So they basically, there was a problem. It was not reliable. They basically had to not use it, and so there was like maybe like 3-week or 4-week delay in rolling out a new test. Those 4 weeks were critical. That was the very beginning of the pandemic. If we could have contained it then, we would have been on much better footing. And this corresponded with another horrible government failure, which was that the FDA refused to allow universities that were perfectly capable of making their own PCR tests. In fact, they had made their own PCR tests, including the University of Washington. They forbid them from using them as a diagnostic test or from using them to track cases. So the University of Washington was conducting studies on basically virus prevalence. They were studying the flu, and then they developed this diagnostic test, and they said, hey, we can just test people who come in to test for the flu. We can see whether they have a novel coronavirus at the time, is what it was called. And the FDA said, no, you're not allowed to. And I think part of the story is that they ended up doing it anyway, which is sort of heroic of them. But the fact that we had a government agency sort of impeding progress on tracking a global pandemic in the most crucial stages, it's just not, it's not acceptable. And I hope we learned from that failure, because that was such a critical time, and we had the technology to deal with it. We had the technology to track this thing, and we totally didn't. So I mean, that's one thing that just stands out really starkly from this. In terms of international spread, I think Italy had some potential. I think that we looked in wastewater and found maybe in December there was actually maybe a few cases in Italy, which makes sense. So we know that I think in the very early December there were cases in Wuhan, and so there are lots of planes from Wuhan all over the world. So it makes sense that there could have been some early spread from there. I wish we knew more about the emergence in Wuhan. I think the reason why there are lots of conspiracy theories is because it is extremely odd that it emerged in Wuhan, given the closest relatives of the virus, right? It seems like the closest relatives live in southern China, which is quite far. Of course, there's lots of potential explanations here. I think animal smuggling, animal husbandry. Emerging diseases are very interesting because they're fundamentally human caused, even if they come from animals, right? Because it's not like the animals are jumping over to human populations in order to go hang out, right? It's like humans are sort of going into animal environments, or humans are cultivating lots of animals, whether it's pigs or whatever. So the 2009 pandemic, H1N1, was the result of basically humans having lots and lots of pig farms. I think in Mexico there was a bunch of recombination events that eventually led to a novel pandemic. So even in cases, which are most cases where this pandemic comes from a natural source, we have to track it down, because we have to understand what were we doing that sort of led to an environment where this virus could evolve and jump over into the human population, because that's going to keep happening until we can figure out the root cause. And so my work has been mostly focused on how can we have a better process for understanding these things? How can we have a sort of solid epistemic process that is both has integrity and is legible to other people? Because instead what we have is we have scientists who have their own particular incentives of they want to maintain their grant funding. We have countries that want to scapegoat other countries. And an example of the sort of Trump wanting to blame the Wuhan Institute of Virology, wanting to blame China in particular, it's sort of interesting, because if you actually look deeper into that story, what you find is that even if it was the case that it did escape from a lab in Wuhan, that would not make the U.S. not culpable, because the National Institute of Health funded EcoHealth Alliance in order to conduct sort of studies that looked at how you can make SARS-like coronavirus more transmissible between humans. So even if that was the case, it was not like that this was China's fault. It was then that would have been an oversight in terms of the chief U.S. funding body giving research. So that shouldn't actually, if we're sort of evaluating this neutrally, we shouldn't take that claim and be like, oh, we should blame China for this. We should say, oh, if we're going to evaluate this, we need to think about how the international scientific community is handling these risks, as opposed to trying to pin it on one particular country. So my research has been sort of focused on, well, how do we as an international community deal with this? Because if we can't deal with it with something like this, we're much less likely to be able to deal with it for something that's an engineered pandemic, where it could be much more severe.
It's interesting. I have joked that if I had the opportunity to go back and speak to myself as a college student, I would tell my earlier self essentially, no, don't focus on getting good grades or passing exams or making money. What you need to do with your life is travel to China and become an advocate against the consumption of exotic animals. So try to get as many people to drop the habit of eating any animal that is not conventionally consumed in the Western world. And of course, the younger me would be baffled by this kind of advice, but imagine if that kind of cultural change had transpired in China over the past decade. At the very least, the probability of such a virus transferring over to the human population would have been greatly reduced. Now, there are some comments about the future of meat consumption, and some are suggesting that perhaps this is the century where humans might stop eating meat altogether. Others are suggesting 3D printed meat, lab-grown meat, as an alternative that doesn't require the killing of animals. Do you think that's a long-term solution, where if all meat is artificially engineered in a lab, then perhaps we wouldn't have these issues of viruses that originate in animals passing to humans through the consumption of their meat?
I think you'd have much less risk of spillovers from domestic animals into humans if you had a lab-controlled environment where your domestic animals is basically, you know, a cell culture. So I do think that would be, you know, a really great development if we could do it. I am not super optimistic about the economics or the scaling of that technology, because while we are pretty good at growing things in a lab, it's also very expensive, and I think it's very hard to scale that to the level of agriculture. Like, we actually have a lot of systems for scaling agriculture, some of which I'm not a fan of. I think a lot of the factory farming practices are pretty terrible, both from a perspective of pandemic risk, but also from a perspective of just cruelty and, you know, treating sentient organisms like they're, you know, just a piece of a production machine. But you know, I think in terms of, there are some parts of this that I think are much easier than others. So I think like eggs and milk proteins are much easier. I had some ice cream the other day that was using lab-made milk protein, and it tasted just like normal ice cream. And I was like, oh, all right, well, we're actually a lot further along here than I thought we would be. So I think for some of the simpler animal products, it would be pretty easy to replace with a, you know, newer tech. So I think that would be cool. I think in the long term, we will get to the point where we do, you know, lab-grown stuff, and it will be more efficient. And be indistinguishable, you know, passing the meat turn test or whatever, from natural meat. That just seems like the obvious thing to do. And maybe there'll be an intermediate grounds where we have like weird niches where you can like eat some, like, you know, very exotic animal, but you know, it's actually not that exotic animal. It's just that those cells grown in a lab. Or here's the controversial take. Maybe people will like, maybe celebrities will like auction off their own cells so you can, like, you know, eat human meat, which would be maybe gross for some, but I'm sure there'll be a market for that, given the weird variety of human tastes out there. As to whether that's ethical or not, I don't know. I'll leave that up to other people. But
we have unfortunately had far too close an experience with that kind of conduct, Jeffrey. Those who know know. Suffice it to say, behind this organization, and it has been very thoroughly and rigorously addressed, so that we do not believe it will happen again. But with regard to lab-grown meat, we are strongly of the view that it should be limited to other species only, not human meat, for a variety of reasons, prion disease being one of them.
Yeah.
There's a reason why there's a taboo against cannibalism. Every society, including pre-scientific societies that made it past some very early filter, the societies that engaged in cannibalism just did not make it, did not survive. It was, I would say, a form of natural selection that the societies that engaged in that practice died out. It wasn't just because it's destructive of human life. I would suggest that eating meat of the same species is destructive for health reasons as well, and that is why those societies did not persist.
Are you saying the Transhumanist Party has an anti-cannibal stance here?
Well, we do. We published a very strong statement opposing cannibalism of all forms. So now we are again on the record.
Well, yeah, we had to, for PR reasons at the very least, because one of our someone who's now left the party did this stunt where they supposedly grew a culture of their own skin cells and then ate.
That's funny. I thought I was bringing this up as a joke, but yeah, okay, all right.
No,
That's,
it's something that we've had to deal with, and it is not good from a PR standpoint to be associated with anything involving human meat consumption. Doesn't matter if it's now. I mean, yeah. So
I think it's a real serious point here, right? Which is like human taboos exist for a reason, and like I think it is really good to
I don't think that taboo is going to go away. Theoretically, I think it can be safe. I mean, I think the prions is mostly in the brain, and there's probably ways of ensuring it's safe. But I think there'll always probably be just an instinctual taboo against it.
Well, and I think there's this piece here. I think when I was younger, I was like, let's break all the taboos. Like the ancient wisdom doesn't apply anymore. Let's just go full ahead on eroding like norms that don't make sense anymore. And I think there is there's something to that. Like, there's something about pushing the bounds. But I also think there's something about trying to have a really wide umbrella where I think part of what I think maybe a good goal of transhumanists is to help people who are sort of not inclined to push the frontier be able to understand the benefits of new technology, right? So when we're talking about genetically engineering humans, we can say no, like this isn't like, it's not that we want to make crazy monsters. What we want to do is like help people have better immune systems, right? And so I think like needless breaking of taboos in order to sort of like be edgy can be against can go against that purpose, right? Can actually hurt the cause of actually helping people become more adapted to technology that could really benefit them.
Yes, someone is speaking sense here. I wish you were around a few months ago to speak sense to that individual, though others of us have tried. And suffice it to say, the Transhumanist Party has made significant strides internally to strongly discourage this kind of transgression's sake. We know that it exists in some segments of our community, but as you pointed out, it's quite counterproductive to the broad, which is to enable these ideas and these technologies to become more mainstream.
Yeah, there's if you're going to do a stunt, you have to be very careful what kind of stunt you're going to do, because some may be very off-putting. Yeah, it's definitely.
Yes, indeed. Now, oddly enough, I think this is a good bridge to the next subject area, which is biology and its applications for human benefit, because I know, Jeffrey, this is one of your specialties. So when we talk about mainstreaming transhumanism, of course, one of the great ways to do that is to show people some practical improvements in their day-to-day lives that could be derived from these emerging technologies. So where do you think advances in biology could take us in the next several years, especially, one, to show people the greater feasibility of the transhumanist project, and two, to solve some of the pressing problems that humankind faces today?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I definitely spend more time thinking about the risks than I do thinking about the benefits. But right, the benefits is sort of the whole point of like how we want to get there. I think I'm most excited about medical technology, and I think as I get older, I start thinking more about aging, and I'm not super optimistic that we will reach escape velocity in my lifetime. In fact, I'm pretty pessimistic about that. But we'll see. I think it'd be great, but I just that's my current view. But I think what we can do is make a lot of progress on making aging less bad, on making brains healthier into older age. I think dementia and Alzheimer's are awful, and to the extent that we can mitigate those, I think that's huge. And I think also, like, I appreciate the anti-aging community's approach of trying to treat some of the root causes of aging, trying to understand the root causes of aging, because like that's, I think it's going to take a while for us to really understand these systems because they're very complex and they're very hard. But there's no reason we shouldn't start now. And I think that it's quite possible that we will discover a lot of things that will really mitigate aging. And so I think some people get sort of think that because it's really hard that we shouldn't even try. And I'm like, no, like, would you want to take a therapy that had a 40% chance of curing your illness as opposed to a 0% chance? Like, yeah, you probably would. So there are a lot of things that in the medical world where we don't have the solution, but we can mitigate the harm a lot. I mean, HIV is just a great example of, well, no, we can't cure most people entirely, but we can allow you to live a mostly normal life. And so I think when it comes to biomedical technology and anti-aging technology in particular, I'm excited about it because I think that we can make human life we can just make our lives way better. We can make a lot of people's lives way better. And so, yeah, let's do that. And some of these, it's funny because like, what's like transhumanist versus what's normal? Well, it's all transhumanist, right? Like a vaccine is transhumanist. And one thing I'm excited about is, so I haven't gotten allergy shots before, but I have like kind of bad allergies, like dust and a lot of pollens and stuff like that. And I'm thinking about going and getting the shots because it's quite a few shots. It's like you have to go in like once a week for like a few years. But it can really change what you're allergic to. And it's sort of a very interesting example of like, you are like slowly training your immune system to recognize these things as not threats. And there's something about the regularity of that process and the duration of that process that's just like, oh yeah, this is like a small taste of the future. Hopefully it'll be way easier in the future. But just to be like, this natural system is not configured well. Let's just alter that a bit. Let's make that something that like won't get in your way and will actually help you. And so it's like, yeah, that's great. Like, let's have more things like that. So yeah, that whole space is just very exciting to me.
So you seem to think that these incremental technological advances will help mitigate some of the damage of human aging, but wouldn't quite reach longevity, escape velocity. Do you think they could extend the maximum human lifespan, or at least the time frame of youthfulness for the human organism? And if so, by how much within our lifetimes, in your view?
Yeah, I'm not sure I want to like give a number because it's far enough for my field that I'm an informed layperson. So I've talked to Aubrey and stuff, but like I'm sure you have him on the show and he'll say like a lot more coherent things than I will. I think that so this is sort of a random tangent. I'm excited about the approach of trying to improve longevity in pets. I've seen several companies do that recently, and I think that's a really great idea because one, pets die really, really young, and that's really tragic. And like, if we can improve, I think we can improve the lives of those pets and improve the lives of their owners by helping those pets. And also, there's way less regulatory hurdles for getting those things approved. And I think I actually think it's quite ethical, but I think it's just like a pretty net positive in my view. So, I think that's a good approach. In terms of the escape velocity question, I think for me, there's, I think we can expand. I think we can expand the maximum human lifespan. Although I'm not well familiar enough to know like which exactly, like, I bet there's probably some rigorous answer of like the maximum human lifespan. What is the thing that is most likely to fail? Like, I don't know if it's the heart. I don't know if it's cancer. I don't know if it's the brain. I bet, in each of these things, we could make some small advances where we could extend the maximum span. I think it's quite likely that we'll start to run into problems where we'll have increasing diminishing returns. And so we'll be able to make small progress, but like these systems will be really complex. Humans have a lot of bandwidth limitations, in terms of communication. And, there's just parts where the complexity becomes too great and we just can't make further progress. So I think in the long term, the bottleneck here will be AGI. So when I think about like timelines for escape velocity, I think it doesn't make that much sense to think about them without thinking about AGI timelines. And I think that this is a complicated subject because now you're dealing with two technological forecasting questions instead of one. And you also have to think about AI risk here because I don't think you should rush to develop AGI in order to like escape in your lifetime. I think that presents a sort of bad incentive to be sort of cut corners for your own sake in order to you might be sort of sacrificing the entire species for your benefit, and that seems unethical. That being said, I do think that it is very important to get to a good AI future in order to allow humans to be, flourishing as possible, right? Like, I think that if we can get, really good aligned AGI, that can help humans live much healthier, potentially, I think at that point, there's no reason why humans need to have a finite lifespan. Death could be a choice that would be much better. But I just think we're pretty unlikely to get there before AGI, even if AGI doesn't happen for 1,000 years. So there's a sort of longer question of like, what AGI not happening for 1,000 years? That's crazy. Like, how could that happen? I think there's a lot of ways that could happen, but some of them are technology progresses, but progresses unevenly in different fields, and you can hit plateaus, you can hit bottlenecks, and you can also go back in time, right? You can also see loss of progress. So we've seen this with some rocket technologies. There are things that we did, a few decades ago that we can no longer do. We haven't been back to the moon in a while. So this can happen in any technological field, because some technologies depend on a lot of infrastructure, depends on a lot of inputs. You could have a nuclear war that could really set back a lot of different technologies, or some sort of really terrible biodisaster. And the technologies are built upon a whole lot of other technologies, a whole lot of other infrastructure, and we just don't know what the future is going to be like. So I think, we hope that technology will keep progressing in a really beneficial way, but we can't say that for certain. So it may be the case that we start to go into these cycles of like technological innovation and then some decline. And so there hasn't been a lot of work in this sort of theoretical space, but it's something I'm very interested in because I think we have a tendency to project a pretty naive view of technological development. And I think that there's actually some good arguments for why what might happen could be significantly different than what we might think.
And it's interesting because you're certainly a bit younger than I am. And if you think longevity, escape velocity won't arrive in time for you, that's a pretty pessimistic forecast for me. So I'm trying to figure out what can be done in order to make sure that it arrives in time for me and for others of our officers, like David Shoemaker, for example. Because
I think cryo might be your best bet in that case, right?
I've often said I don't want to be part of the first generation to receive these kinds of treatments. I want to be part of the second or third generation to receive these kinds of treatments, because obviously they'll be a lot safer, more reliable, more accessible. But it seems, in your view, the bottleneck is one of processing capability. At least if I'm understanding your position correctly, you think it's such a complex problem that the human mind, without the assistance of AGI, wouldn't be able to discern all of the mechanisms involved and how to reverse the damage. What do you think about the SENS approach, essentially, where you don't need understanding so much as just the technical capability to clean out the damage every so often, every 10 years, every 20 years, and reset the aging clock, so to speak?
I think that might be pretty good. I think it might get you somewhat far. But I think you're going to run into problems where it just doesn't quite work. And so, even if we got the human lifespan to 200, I think, yeah, you're going to start getting to the point where like you're trying to solve your problems are popping up faster than you can solve them, or it gets so expensive that maybe there's a few billionaires that can live to 300 or whatever, but like most people can't. So I think ultimately we want this technology to be scalable so that everyone can have it. Yeah, so I don't know. I think for you guys, if you're really wanting to be immortal, I would say bet on cryo plus strong AGI in the future. Cryo has I'm sure you guys have talked a lot about cryo. I think it has its own potential problems, but if there are people that are frozen until we had friendly AI, it seems pretty likely that those people could be recovered. To me, I think that I sort of have like a lot of confidence in future capabilities once you have an intelligence explosion of some kind. That's sort of my school of thought. Now, I have a lot of uncertainty in this space, so I'm not going to speak with confidence. I'm going to say I don't know. I've thought about this a lot, and that's what it seems to me to indicate. But you know, also there's no guarantee that even if you are frozen, that your frozen body lasts that long, right? Like maybe there's a nuclear war, maybe there's just a normal conventional war, or much more mundanely, maybe the company goes out of business and can't keep the thing anymore, right? That's like probably the more likely thing to happen. So yeah, there's lots of problems with this, but it's like if you want to gamble on the long term, there's some ways to do that.
This is a great advertisement for our upcoming virtual Enlightenment Salon on cryonics, which will be next week on Sunday at 1 p.m. U.S. Pacific time. We'll have Rudy Hoffman, who is an agent specializing in life insurance for cryonics purposes. And then we'll have Matthew Bryce Deutsch, who is a cryonics advocate. So we will let them know that cryonics was mentioned in this virtual Enlightenment Salon. I do like it when we have a bridge from one conversation to another. So thank you, Jeffrey, for providing that. Now, I would like to offer the U.S. Transhumanist Party officers the opportunity to make their closing remarks. And if you have any additional questions for Jeffrey, now is the time to ask. And as is our custom, we'll conclude after that with a closing statement from our guests. So who would like to make the first closing remark?
I can go. On a fake meat, I think we don't really need to grow the meat in a lab. Just yesterday, I ate a plant-based fake meat. I made tacos with it, and I cannot make the difference. I cannot feel the difference from the regular meat. So it's already there. It's in a grocery store. You can just go and buy it. You don't have to wait several decades for the lab-grown meat. On a social networks, I would recommend not only escape the social network bubble, but also escape the social bubble. We tend to surround ourselves with like-minded people, and it feels comfortable when everyone agree on everything. But I would encourage everyone to go to different communities, go to the people who you disagree with or who disagree with you, and have this dialogue. And only through the dialogue we can overcome this polarization. Also, I tend to agree, Jeffrey, on aging and AGI. Aging might be a too complex problem for human level of intelligence, and probability that we will need AGI to solve it, it's pretty high. So that's why it's so important to preserve the civilization, because without civilization, without working social institutions, science not gonna work. There's gonna be no progress, not about aging, not about AGI, and we will be stuck and keep dying. So that's why it's important to to avoid existential risks and preserve the culture and civilization. And the final question for Jeffrey, how would you work with the problems from a category unknown of unknown, considering that we don't have an AGI and we're not AGI ourselves?
Yeah, I think unknown unknowns are difficult, right? Like, and I think this is sort of a problem with any field. It's not just the greatest scale or greatest scope, right? In computer security, we also have to deal with unknown unknowns. We don't know what kind of exploits people might be developing. We don't know what actors might be out there that we don't know about. And I think we can. There are ways to try to explore the search space to try to figure out what unknowns we might have missed. There are ways to try to build things to be more robust to account for things that we might have missed. We can always get it wrong, but I think there are things we can really do about that. And then some of it is just hard, and that's just the way it is.
All right, thank you, Pavel and Jeffrey. Now let's go to Art Ramon. Do you have any closing comments?
One question. 15 years ago, I read a book on the water wars. And, all these past 15 years, I've been keeping an eye out for the water wars, but I haven't heard squat. Do you know where this might actually happen, the water wars, where countries are at war with each other over the resource of water?
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the argument that conflict over water will lead directly to wars. I think I have seen evidence of geopolitical tensions over over water sources. There are countries where a dam is in one location, or the countries want to build a dam in one location that would significantly impact things downstream. I think what's probably the case is that water is just is a very important resource, and it's part of a complex set of other resources. And so I think we won't see water wars per se, but we'll see conflicts over a collection of resources, of which water will be one. But I'm not super familiar with that particular argument.
Okay, well, thank you for coming.
All right, thank you, Art Ramon. Now, there was a question in the chat that I wanted to quickly raise. Jeffrey, how can people get in contact with you if they have further questions for you or want to find out more about your work?
Twitter is probably the easiest way. So I'm at Jeff Ladish on Twitter. I usually go by Jeffrey, but my Twitter handle is Jeff because I started it a long time ago. That's a pretty good way. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
All right, thank you. And now we go to Dan Elton for his closing remarks.
Well, I thought this was a great conversation. I think we stayed on the most pressing risks, which are bio and AI. So I thought that was good. And I like the last point you made about, looking at the roots of progress. There, I wanted to just put just interject and drop the field of progress studies here, because that is an initiative proposed by I believe Tyler Cohen, and to study the cultural and social conditions that cause scientific progress. And it actually hasn't been studied as like a specific thing much. So I think a lot of work in that area would be helpful for ensuring continued technological growth and advancement of science. I don't think we should take it for granted. I think a lot of people who watched Kurzweil sort of felt like, that singularity was inevitable, but now I think, fortunately, people are wisening up to the fact that someone actually has to do all this scientific research. And so I basically encourage people to look into progress studies. They have a Slack, they have a website, they have an email list. It's like a growing movement right now. And I just want to thank Jeffrey for coming on. I think this was great.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And yeah, +1 on progress studies. I think they're doing pretty interesting work.
Excellent. Well, now we come to that time when we hear closing remarks from our guest. And by the way, it has been pointed out in the chat that Jeffrey also is an expert on cybersecurity, and there are some people who are interested in what kinds of security risks an organization like ours should look out for. and how can we best secure our web assets, like our Facebook groups, for example. So if you want to address that as part of your closing remarks, feel free to do so, but also more generally, your thoughts about this discussion and any areas where you would like to comment further.
Yeah, totally. Happy to say a few things about that. I mean, one thing, you could hire me, so that would be helpful. But yeah, so I think generally, like the things that I recommend for organizations like this, and this kind of organization sort of is in the reference class of organizations I tend to advise. It's all pretty simple stuff, but it's like make sure that you're using strong two-factor authentication. All your admins are. Facebook supports YubiKeys, so you can use a couple YubiKeys to make sure that anytime you log in from a new device, you have to use those. Use a password manager, use unique passwords for every account. Make sure that your computer is up to date and your browser is always up to date. So these are just standard best practice for operational security. But I think the key thing is implementation. So as an organization, make sure that you have a spreadsheet where you check off, is everyone doing this thing? It doesn't have to be YubiKeys, but it should be some type of strong two-factor authentication and always strong passwords. I think that's the main thing, right? If you do that, you've gone 80% of the way. There are, of course, more specialized things you can do, but yeah, if you just did that, you'd be pretty good, right? Like if Hillary Clinton would have used a Gmail and strong two-factor authentication, her email server wouldn't have gotten hacked. So yeah, and Google could have seen all of her emails. But yeah, so like there are things you can do here. They're not that hard, but they do take some work, right? They take some effort being put into that. So yeah, that's what I'd say about security. Yeah, in terms of closing remarks, well, so thanks for having me. This was great. I really appreciate all the questions and all the engagement. This is great. So I appreciate what you're doing here. I think that the world is like already in this transhumanist transition phase, and just people don't realize it. And so it's cool that you guys are sort of out there trying to. Oh, I just saw it in chat. I am saying YubiKeys, YubiKeys. It's a company that makes these like security keys. But yeah, so as I was saying, yeah, we're already here, and the world hasn't quite realized that, but we're rapidly transitioning. So I appreciate the work that you guys are doing, and what I would really like to see is more sort of attention and time and effort in the political space to trying to figure out what some of these international solutions are. Because a lot of these problems cannot be dealt with merely at the national level. There is a lot we can do at the national level, and it's worth trying to work on unilateral disarmament. But a lot of these things will require international movements and international discussions. And so I think I just encourage people to work on that, to the extent that they can, or be engaged with that where they can. And some of these things are sort of beyond the horizon, things that we really need, but we don't know how to do yet, like make entirely new governance structures. But some of them are things that we have templates for, right? Some of these are things like, well, we have managed to mitigate a lot of nuclear proliferation. We have managed to, shut down bioweapon programs in the past. So I would just encourage people to stay engaged at the international level, and remember that we are all on the same planet, and we, in some ways, have all of our fates wrapped up together.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for your thoughtful comments today. We had a great conversation ranging from existential risk to online security and a lot of subjects in between. We greatly appreciate your time and your insights, Jeffrey. And again, I would like to remind our viewers we have these virtual enlightenment salons every Sunday, generally at 1 p.m. Pacific time. And our next virtual enlightenment salon will be on Sunday, October 18th. And that will be our cryonics panel. So I hope to see everyone there. And in the meantime, live long and prosper.